Hi, this is Paul Zykofsky. I'm an associate director at the Local Government Commission. I've worked here for close to 20 years, and I oversee our work on community design, healthy communities, and water programs. What I'm going to talk about today is smart growth and sustainable development, and I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about how the Local Government Commission got working on these issues. And it really dates back to 1991. When we came up with something we call the Ahwahnee Principles, so named because they were first presented at a conference we did at the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite back in 1991. And what we did was bring together a number of leading architects and planners who were working on innovative solutions to community design. And what we were looking for was a way to respond to our members and local governments' concern over sprawling, poorly planned development in their communities. In California, we've seen a lot of battles over the years about growth, and a lot of it has to do with the type of growth that communities get and things that really diminish quality of life. So what we were trying to do back in 1991 was come up with a set of principles that would really address how new development and growth could happen in a community and actually augment or improve quality of life. And that's what these Ahwahnee Principles did. And they really were a fairly simple and straightforward approach. They talked about revitalizing existing parts of our communities through what we call infill development. And then if we are going to be adding new neighborhoods or new towns, to really plan those as complete and integrated communities with a mix of uses, with different uses within walking distance of one another. For longer trips, you'd have transit, so you might be able to access the transit stop by walking to it, with a diversity of housing types and with a center focus. And if you think about it, that's really the way a lot of our older communities were planned and grew over time. If you go to an old downtown, for example, you'll see that things are laid out that way. You have a mix of uses, things are close to one another, they're not all that spread out, and it's actually fairly easy to get around even without a car in a lot of those communities. We also see that pattern of development in small towns. If you look at sort of a main street of a small town, again, you have Main Street, you have retail there, you may have some offices, and then the housing may be either on that block or a block away. So what we're looking at here is really going back to traditional forms of neighborhoods and neighborhood development. Now, the problem is that in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've been building a lot of our communities to look like this. Really to be focused around transportation based on the automobile, on person driving themselves from one place of the community to another. And this photo happens to be interesting because if you look carefully, you'll find there's only one person that's not in a car, and they're standing in that narrow median there. And my friend who took this photo in Missoula, Montana, tells the story that, or actually the joke, that he went back 3 days later and that person was still standing there. So these are challenging streets to get across. They're places that don't encourage people to linger or spend time in the public realm, which is against the street, sidewalks, public plazas, and so on, that really only support transportation by car. And the result with a lot of this type of development, as we've seen over the last 50, 60 years, is that if you create streets and highways for ease of use by cars, then guess what? More cars come, and within a few years, those roads are congested, as we see in this shot of a highway or freeway, or in this case, an arterial roadway on the outskirts, in this case, of the city of Denver, where people have spread out further, they're using these big streets to commute further, and if we add more lanes to these roads within a few months or years, those lanes are as congested as they were before because people start moving further out, start driving more, and we really don't solve the problem in any way. And in some regions of the country, this comes from Atlanta, Georgia, they're looking at just crazy things like expanding highways to 23 lanes and just having these enormous highways, which, as I pointed out, don't really solve the problem because they just encourage people to drive more and to spread out further. And the issue that we face in this country is that there's still population growth. If we see the U.S. as a whole, this is going back to census projections from 2000 to 2030, we were expecting to grow by about 30% in that 30-year period. If If you look at California, we're a little bit higher than that, and then there's many states, especially out in the west or the southeast, that are still expected to grow even faster than that. So how do we accommodate that population growth, and as I said earlier, actually create places that are livable, where quality of life is really desirable? So a lot of this comes down to land use. How do we plan and design our communities? And in California and around the country now, we're recognizing the importance of this when it comes to climate change. Transportation accounts for the biggest portion of greenhouse gas emissions. In California overall, it's about 40% of those emissions. In cities, in parts of the state like the Bay Area, we see that it's as much as 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from that region. A little bit less when you go down to the LA region, but even there, still a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from transportation. And when we look at how do we address this problem, really what we're trying to do is reduce vehicle miles traveled, because that's what's adding to those greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. And you look at a series of integrated strategies which have been discussed for the last few years in California to try to address this problem of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And you look at, an important area is land use. And I'll talk about that in a fair amount of detail today. There's also other issues that we do need to be thinking about, like transportation conservation. How do we actually get people to drive less? TDM, or transportation demand management programs, often working with employers to get employees to not have to drive as much. There's pricing signals, of course. If it costs more to park your car at work or downtown where you commute, then people are going to tend to want to use their cars less. And then, of course, there's the issue of just building the infrastructure for other modes, for transit, carpools, bicycling, and walking. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. Now, the potential for shifting trips from cars to walking and bicycling, we think, is really pretty significant. If you look at all trips that people take in this country, about 50%, and these are based on household surveys, are less than 50% are less than 3 miles. 28% are less than 1 mile. So when you think about that, a 1 mile trip by walking is about a 20-minute trip. So that's something that most people could easily do, and yet we still find that of those 28% trips that are less than a mile, 60% are being taken by car. So we think there's a lot of potential with this, especially this segment of trips, the ones that are less than 3 miles and less than 1 mile, to really start shifting, if we create the right infrastructure, to shift those to bicycling and to walking. And when you look at the range that people can reach by walking, say 20 minutes, that's that 1 mile radius, you see that can encompass a fairly large part of a city. You're looking here at maps of actually Manhattan, just along Central Park West, and it almost covers from one end of the island to another. By bicycle, a 10-minute bicycle ride covers even more of an area, so you can get out to 1.5 miles. So there have been studies over the years that really try to look at, well, how much can smart growth save? How much can we reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled or household vehicle miles traveled if we change the way we develop our communities? And there are some studies that have been done, and this comes from a book from a few years ago called Growing Cooler, which looked at the fact that more compact development, that is, building up instead of out, can reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled by 20 to 50% relative to the normal trend. And with some pricing strategies, there's even greater savings that could be accomplished. There were also some studies done back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that looked at vehicle miles traveled per household in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you see the same kind of trend as you might expect. People living closer into San Francisco, to Oakland, to the major employment centers, were traveling a lot less than people living out in the suburbs. Fairly common sense research result, but one again that informs us as to how we need to design our communities to get people to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And then there are these studies that look at vehicle miles traveled per capita versus density. So when you look at higher density housing, that's looking out towards the right on this chart, you'll notice that daily vehicle miles per person start to drop off, whereas people living in areas, this is in the Baltimore region, living in more suburban areas where densities are lower, where there's fewer households per acre, are traveling a lot more miles per day than in the other areas. And then here's again another example of that. This comes from another study looking at a low density area and seeing how many vehicle miles traveled are generated per household compared to sort of a suburban transit village. This is in the Oakland area versus sort of urban center in San Francisco. And you see a pretty significant drop in vehicle miles traveled per household in these cases. So now when we talk about smart growth and livable communities, there are certain common themes that we often refer to, and I've already hit on some of these, but one of those, of course, is more efficient use of land. We want to try to fill in older parts of our communities before we spread out. We also want to build our new communities in a more compact way. There's also this emphasis on mixing uses, on having different uses closer to one another, mixing commercial and retail uses, having them close to where people live and work. Also creating town and neighborhood centers where communities can gather for special events, places where people and residents and neighbors and so on can get to know one another. Obviously having more destinations. When you have a mix of uses, of course, you have more destinations in walking and bicycling distance. And of course, then we also need to create the infrastructure to support walking, bicycling, and transit use. All of this, we believe, helps to create strong local and regional economies. It's a more cost-effective way of using our scarce resources at the local level. And as we'll see in slides that follow, it costs less to build in this way than when we spread out and sprawl more. And finally, a very important aspect of smart growth and livable communities is this issue of involving residents in the planning process. So we'll talk about all of these. And when we get to this economic issue, I think it's important to also recognize that a lot of communities now in the sort of new economy era that we're facing, where a lot more jobs are based on knowledge base, less are based on resources, that companies now, as this report from Collaborative Economics put it, now compete on quality, and communities will too. And also that creating these places where businesses and people want to live isn't really a luxury, it's an economic imperative. If your city wants to be successful, you have to be a place that attracts the best talent in your particular field or business. And we see this reflected also in terms of why people decide where to live. This is from a survey done by the National Association of Realtors a few years ago. And you'll notice that the second highest issue that people weighed when deciding where to live was sidewalks and places to take walks. They also wanted to be within an easy walking distance of other places and things in the community. They also wanted to have a short commute to work. So all of these are things that would be supported by the kind of smart growth, livable communities, or sustainable development approaches that we'll talk about. There's also been a debate over the years, and attacks on smart growth as being against cars, anti-suburbs, telling people where how they should live, and so on. And really, we want to emphasize again, or that we're somehow against growth, that we're no growth or slow growth. The reality is that we're really talking about well-planned growth that helps to improve quality of life and doesn't diminish or deteriorate the quality of life that people have as this new development or this new growth occurs. So I'm going to go through the principles of smart growth, livable communities, based on a set of principles developed back in the late 90s by a group that was actually sponsored or supported by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency called the Smart Growth Network. And these principles have sort of, have stood the test of time, you might say. They've been around now for over 10 years, over 15 years, and still seem to work well. We have seen in recent years, I'd say, more emphasis on social equity issues, which probably aren't addressed as well by these, although they are incorporated here as well. So let's go through each of these principles. First of all, one of the things that we really emphasize in sustainable development and smart growth is preserving open space, farmland, and critical environmental areas. And what that means is that when we're planning how to grow, especially into one of these areas that's considered a greenfield that doesn't have development already on it, we try to identify which are the areas that should not be built on, that should be preserved for the long term, either because they have high value for agriculture or because they have high value for wildlife preservation or for or maybe they're just not suitable for development, like steep slopes or areas that have wetlands. And then we can use preservation tools like transfer of development rights or purchase of those lands or incentive programs to really try to make sure the development occurs in areas where it's appropriate. And the reason this is so important is, again, we're seeing large swaths of land across our country being consumed by development in areas that really we should be protecting. So in the Atlanta region, which is we're sort of highlighting here as the poster child for sprawl, we saw from 73 to 92 a significant amount of forest land that was basically plowed over and developed with, you know, shopping centers and parking lots the way we see in this image. And there's estimates that that region was losing 27 acres of tree cover every single day. Now, obviously, this has a significant impact on all kinds of environmental issues, including increasing the average temperature in the area. When you start replacing trees with asphalt, you're raising the temperature, which then leads to formation of ozone and other pollutant gases that are unhealthy for people. And, you know, it increases pollutant runoff into our rivers and streams and so on. So this has a lot of negative effects, and we really want to try to not build in this way. We also see in this image here that covers, you know, the Atlanta region all the way up to Raleigh-Durham, the way we've now, you know, by building further and further out, we're now creating these megalopolises that are hundreds of miles in length. That only make it, again, harder for us to focus on development inside our towns and to make those communities work. You could see a similar pattern of development in the Los Angeles region, for example, over the last 100 years or so. So there are some tools that we can use, and there's actually these have been around for quite a while. Planner Ian McHarg back in the 60s wrote this book, Design with Nature, where he laid out a mapping process whereby you identify in your region what are the key issues with the land that you're potentially developing, and map those out. And you can do overlays, which then help you identify where you should and shouldn't build. And this will depend. This will differ from region to region. In some region, agricultural lands will be very important. Say the Central Valley of California, the soils for agriculture will be key. In the foothill areas, slopes are going to be a bigger determinant of where you may or may not want to build. But basically, the tools are there for us to use this approach. The second issue, which of course ties in with this, and a lot of these principles, as we go through them, you'll see are related to one another. It's hard to take one and just sort of focus on that. They really are all connected. The second one is really about this infill development, about strengthening and directing development towards existing communities. And the image you see here of this document, A Policymaker's Guide to Infill Development, is something the Local Government Commission published back in the mid-90s, and actually updated, I think, in 99 or 2000, that really talks about the importance of building in these older parts of our communities, either reusing brownfield sites, which are sites that are contaminated by industry or other types of pollution, and reusing those by cleaning up those lands and putting either housing or retail or commercial development on them, or parks, and also grayfield sites, which are not necessarily contaminated but may be sites that have big, large parking lots. And also part of this issue is preserving and repairing older buildings, historic buildings which connect us to our past, which are part of the cultural heritage of regions. And of course, building on the resources and amenities of what already exists in a community. And that's instead of, again, constantly moving further and further out. And there have been a number of studies which show that by developing in these infill locations, the impacts overall are much, much less. So for example, this study done in the San Diego region in the late 90s found that it was comparing two similar sites, similar in size. One was an infill site, one was a greenfield site out on the edge of the San Diego region. Vehicle miles traveled per capita was half in the infill site, as was auto travel time. Congestion was even less than that. Emissions of oxides of nitrogen, which lead to smog formation, also were much less. Carbon dioxide emissions, as you can see here, again, almost half. And infrastructure costs, and this is a significant one, significantly less in the infill site than out in the greenfield. The reason, obviously, being that in an infill site, you already have a lot of infrastructure. You have the sewers, the water, the electricity, police protection, schools, and so on. You don't need to invest as much in building those from scratch. Mind you, you may still have to upgrade those, so there is some cost there, but it's not going to be as significant as out on the edge of town. And then even at the household cost level, household travel costs, much less in the infill location where you're traveling less distances than out on the edge. A lot of benefits to infill development. Obviously, we can revitalize older parts of our communities, town centers, neighborhoods, provide more housing options, support transit service. And this image that we see here from the Little Italy area of San Diego shows, new development. This was a new building that was built after the light rail line was developed in that part of the city. It's a way to, of course, support the new transit service, provide ridership for that system. It's using land more efficiently. As I mentioned earlier, we're reducing the cost for infrastructure and services. And by building inside the city, we're preserving the agriculture and conserving open space on the outside, on the edges of our urban areas. The other issue that is getting more attention, has been getting more attention in the last few years, is actually filling in not just older downtowns and revitalizing downtowns, which a lot of cities have been doing, but also looking at the opportunities that older commercial strips provide us. And this is a document developed some years ago by the Urban Land Institute that looked at how to reinvent suburban strips. And so that's sort of a new frontier that we're seeing more regions and more cities look at, what to do with these older suburban strips, which now have a lot of vacancies, which are not performing very well, and how to actually fill those in, perhaps with more housing and commercial development. Another part of this, again, these are all connected, is taking advantage of more compact building design. And that really comes back to growing up instead of out. And that's obviously a key way of preserving green spaces and reducing the cost of providing facilities and services. And this is a little bit of a trick question here, but what do you think downtown Florence, a freeway exchange, and a big box store have in common? And if you think about it, for a minute, it's got to do with how much space they take up. And here in the next map we see, here's the old walled city of Florence in the yellow in the middle of that image, with an interchange overlaid on top of it. And you can see that the interchange takes up almost about the same amount of space. In the next image we see a Costco shopping center down in Goleta, and you'll notice that in this case the old walled city of Florence actually is smaller than that large shopping mall with all of its parking around it. So the point to be made here, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, is that we don't need a lot of land, a lot of space, to have a lot of great culture and literature and architecture and all kinds of great things happen in our communities. We can actually do it in a fairly compact footprint. We also know, as I've hinted at various points, that when we build in a more compact way, it costs less. The infrastructure is less expensive. So this comes from a different study. This is one that was done in the 80s and 90s. It was sort of the comprehensive study on the cost of sprawl by Professor Burchell at Rutgers, and basically made the case very clearly that you consume a lot less land, cost for roads is less, cost for utilities is less, cost for schools is less when we build in a more compact way than when we build than when we spread out more and more. And now, new analysis approach that emerged a few years ago is this one developed by a planner, developer in Asheville, North Carolina, Joe Minicozy. And what he did was actually something that, again, a lot of planners had not thought about, but he took sort of the farmer's approach to land, how land is used. And, any farmer, who's growing a crop will know what the yield per acre of that crop is. But for some reason, we hadn't ever really applied that metric to urban development. And what Joe did was basically do that. So he took, in this example, we see a Walmart in Asheville, North Carolina, compared to a downtown building that he actually was a developer for. And he shows, first of all, the land consumed in terms of acres, but then he looks at the yield of those two different plots of land, and it's really shocking to look at the fact that total property taxes per acre are significantly higher on that small plot of land in the downtown, that multi-story building, than at the Walmart. And most cities typically think that the Walmarts, the Costco's, that those are the ones that are really bringing in a lot of property taxes per acre. But in fact, these infill buildings in downtowns are often much bigger producers of revenue than a big shopping mall, which takes up a lot of land, but per acre isn't producing as much. You'll notice that retail taxes, sales taxes per acre, not as dramatic a picture, but even there we still see that the downtown site has more yield. Obviously, when you have a mixed-use building like the one in downtown, you also have residents living there, so you've got more residents per acre, whereas the Walmart isn't providing any housing whatsoever. And even jobs on that small site, the jobs per acre are significantly higher than that large site. So this is a new way of looking at how land is used, which I think is particularly useful for cities that are looking at their bottom line and how revenues will help them pay for services in the community. We also know that with more compact development, we then can really support more walking as well as transit. So in this case, we look at density related to types of trips that people take, and we notice that when we go from about 3 to 4 units to the acre at that part of the curve down to about 20 units to the acre, the number of trips that people are taking in their vehicles starts to decline. And notice also the walking trips start to go up. There are more things closer to where people live, and it's easier for them to walk to places than it is to drive. The same applies to transit. If we're going to build a transit system and make it cost effective, we need to make sure that there are enough either homes around the transit stop or employees around that transit stop. So this chart, for example, looks at what are sort of the minimum requirements for density around, say, a light rail stop or a streetcar stop or a bus rapid transit system. And we find that, for example, for light rail, we really need to get to about 30 housing units per acre or 50 employees per acre to make that cost effective. Otherwise, that transit system is not going to get the riders it needs to basically pay for the service it's providing. You'll notice that for partial bus rapid transit or just even bus transit whatsoever, 5 housing units per acre is about the minimum that you need. Now, if we look at retail, and that's when we want to get that mix of uses, if we want to get more commercial in close to where people live, the corner grocery store, we also find that it's sort of a similar number. We're looking at about 7 units per acre, for example, to support a small convenience store, 10,000 square foot convenience store. And the important thing here to keep in mind is we're not talking about building at high density everywhere. We're talking about at sort of in the center of the neighborhood, in the center of that town, actually getting the density up there. So in this image, we'll see where we see the pink and the brown, the shops, apartments. That's where that higher density is located. That's probably where the transit stop is. That's where the retail is. And then as we move out from that, the center of that neighborhood, it's perfectly okay to see single-family homes on small lots or even larger lot residential development. But at an average, or at least in the core of that neighborhood, we get those densities high enough to support the transit and the retail. The important thing to keep in mind is also that the demographics in this period are really supportive of this type of development. Why? Because we're seeing a significant increase in the older population, folks who are downsizing their homes, They don't need the big house out in the suburbs with a yard, and they don't have the 2.6 children per family that American families used to have. Many of them are now single couples living alone and can move into a part of town where services are closer, where they don't need the large house. And we're seeing a significant increase in this segment of the population. It's being referred to as the aging tsunami. I think it's the last figure I saw was every 11 seconds in this country somebody is turning 65. So we're going to see a doubling of the population that's over 65 in the next 20, 30 years. At the same time, we're seeing the rise of the millennials, and this segment of the population is, very interestingly, also driving less. They're not as concerned about owning a car, and they're much more interested in actually living in these more vibrant in-town locations than previous generations. So both of these demographic trends really support the market for this type of housing. We've talked about mixing land uses. If you look at this image here, this is sort of an old, neighborhood center where, you had apartments above the retail. Pretty typical way of developing, 100, 150 years ago. We're now seeing that come back, and we're also seeing, more office use in these second stories of downtowns. What we're really looking at is changing the pattern of development from what we've been doing the last 60, 70 years, which we see on the right, sort of a conventional pattern, where starting in the 30s and 40s, we started separating uses dramatically. So we decided that at one point it didn't make sense to have, there were factories next to where people lived, and those created some serious health hazards. But we took that to the extreme of moving the corner grocery store out of the neighborhood. So now we have these subdivisions of just houses where there's nothing close by to walk to. Even the schools are not often accessible from those residences. And we have the shopping, the office buildings, the schools separated from where people live. And it's no surprise that people are having to drive more because we've laid things out in a way that supports transportation by car. On the left side of this image, we see traditional pattern of development where we've mixed uses. Different uses are close to one another, and there are good connections that make it easy to get from one to the other. So we'll look at this more when we talk about transportation. But the traditional pattern of development really makes a lot more sense when we want to create a walkable, sustainable neighborhood. And we see examples of this, again, in traditional neighborhoods. This is an older part of Sacramento, Midtown, where this type of development was the norm. We built retail on the ground floor, housing above. And the good news is we're now seeing a lot more examples of this type of development in communities all across California, all across the U.S. This was a vacant parcel, vacant lot, excuse me, until about 15 years ago when the developer came in and built this mixed-use project with retail and restaurants on the ground floor and rental housing above. And we're also seeing another approach to this type of mixed use where instead of building the housing above, we build it next door, what we call horizontal mixed use. So here there's a new Safeway, well, not so new anymore, it's probably been there about 10 years now, and the housing is next to it. What you see on the left there are apartments. So not as urban perhaps, more of a suburban style example of mixed use, but one that again can work well in certain parts of our communities. The other issue that we want to talk about is providing more housing opportunities and choices. If you look at a lot of suburban subdivisions, the type of housing often is built for a very narrow band of incomes. So there'll be the housing for people earning, X amount in the community, and then there'll be the other subdivision for people earning a little bit more, and so on. And we've almost started to create segregation by income in these communities. In older traditional neighborhoods, we see much more of a mix of housing types. In some cases with apartments, near single-family homes, or duplexes next to single families that provide rental housing as well as ownership housing, and really provide for housing at different stages in people's lives. Early in our lives, when we come out of college, we may want to live in an apartment somewhere. Eventually, we may buy a house. And then when we retire or we downsize, we may go back to an apartment. So it makes sense to have these different housing choices and not to have to move to a whole new neighborhood or city to find those. So we're seeing again more examples of this type of mixed income housing. This is in Redwood City, built maybe 15 years ago. It's housing for very low income residents, and it's built right in their downtown, right next to the library and the city hall in the city. In San Diego, we've been seeing this happen for the last 20, 25 years. A lot of infill housing in the downtown, different types of housing. So here we see, excuse me, we see live-work units with a place where somebody can can work downstairs, have their studio or whatever it is, work in computer graphics, and then live above the shop, so to speak. We're also seeing mixed housing types in new neighborhoods. This is a new neighborhood built in Chico about 10 years ago called Doe Mill. So it has single-family homes, as we see here, but it also has some apartments in this, I think it's a quadplex with 4 different units in this building. Here's sort of the inside of the courtyard area of that, a 4-plex. And it also has these bungalows. So these are small houses, maybe 900, 1,000 square feet, around sort of a common court. And again, these are, I think, 5 or 6 houses that share the space, smaller. Often these are owned by single people living alone. And then it also has townhouses. So it has a range of different housing types for different types of residents, as well as for people at different stages in their life. Another issue is providing more transportation choices. And I think this is a point, I'm not sure I made it earlier, about when people attack smart growth as trying to tell people how to live. Really, as we saw with the housing choices issue before and this one with transportation, we're really trying to give people more choices. We're not limiting people's freedom, we're actually expanding. We're providing more options for them. So with transportation, we really want to try to provide more options for people, increase high quality transit service, make it easier to walk, bike, take transit in communities. And we're seeing how that's playing out in cities across the country. So in San Diego, which built its red trolley system back in the 70s and 80s, we now see development, the apartments we see behind, that have been built as a result of that transit system. Here we see another view of that station in San Diego, where we see the old building, which is the brick building in the front, which is now a coffee shop, and then behind it and above, we've seen new housing that has been built, again, at higher density around transit. We're also seeing cities start to build streetcar systems. Portland, Oregon really has been the pioneer in this. Several years ago, they built a streetcar through the downtown that connects to Portland State University as well as to some of the neighborhoods. And it's helped develop whole new areas adjacent and near the downtown. And as well as just supporting more bus transit, like the Portland Bus Mall, which makes it easy for buses coming into downtown with residents who live out in the suburbs. So over the last decades, in Portland, for example, they've seen single passenger drivers coming into downtown decline, and more people use basically very efficient and convenient transit systems. And we're seeing these bus rapid transit systems picked up and developed in other cities. LA, for example, some years ago started putting in their Metro Rapid buses. We're seeing bus rapid transit emerge in other cities. Mexico City and other parts of the world now. This is an example from Mexico City of their Metro bus, which is a bus rapid transit system. They now have 4, I think maybe 5 of these lines that crisscross the city. And these are ways to put in efficient transit at lower cost than a rail system, which is a more expensive system. We're also seeing more cities look to support bicycling transportation. So bicycle share programs are a great way to do that. The city of Lyon, France, was in the upper left, was one of the first to do this, put a few hundred or maybe 1,000 bikes out, and you can pick one up in one place, rent it, and drop it off. These are really set up for short rides. They disincentivize using the bike, say, all day. You really want to pick it up and drop it off within 30 minutes, an hour when you get to your destination. Paris took it to the next level on the upper right by putting over 20,000 bikes out in the city, and now we're seeing cities across the U.S. and across the world pick up on these programs. The one on the bottom right is actually the program in Mexico City, the Zykofsky, which started a few years ago in just one neighborhood and now has expanded to other parts of the city. We're also seeing more infrastructure being built for bicyclists and pedestrians. These happen to be shots from New York City, which has been one of the pioneer really in developing new systems in this country for bicycling and basically creating what are called cycle tracks, where the bicycle lane is separated from the travel lanes. So if you look at the upper left, the image on the left here, you'll notice there's actually a line of parked cars there, and then you have the bike lane separated from the moving traffic. In the upper right, you actually see how at the intersection it's important to make sure that the bicyclist and the pedestrian sort of see each other and negotiate through those intersections. One of the things you also see in that image on the upper right is special signals for the bicyclists. So the bicyclists now have a signal there that tells them when it's safe to proceed. And finally, a really important issue is creating more walkable communities. That is, and all of what we've talked about, the mixing land uses, the building more compactly, the providing the infrastructure, all of this helps to create those more walkable communities. And one of the terms that's emerged in the last 5-6 years is that we really want our streets to be complete. That is, streets that aren't just built for cars, but actually work for everybody, that work for people, that can accommodate people who are in cars, but also accommodate people walking and bicycle using transit. And we know that when we design streets that are well designed, especially in residential neighborhoods, we want streets that are safe, quiet, and slow. That encourages people to get out and walk, ride a bicycle, or take transit instead of driving a car. An important part of this is, again, getting back to the pattern of development. In too many communities, we've separated uses, again, dramatically, as we saw earlier. And what that then does is it makes it really hard to connect from one to the other. So going from the houses to school is not easy because there's no connections from one to the other. So most of the trips then end up on the bigger streets, the arterials. That then forces traffic engineers to build bigger streets, 4, 6, 8-lane arterials, which become very hostile places for people in cars, for people who are not in cars, and actually also hostile places for the motorists, with long wait times at intersections, and really is not a very comfortable way to move around. In the traditional pattern of development, you'll notice that streets connect well. So most of these trips now can be contained or can be managed within that system of narrower streets, quieter streets, and the arterial roadway stays there for the regional trips, the trip to work, to the hospital, to the civic center, but not for the trip to school or the trip to the grocery store. And we again see this reflected if you look at patterns of development. Portland, Oregon, for example, on the left, has 200-foot square blocks, which means that it's a very walkable downtown. It's very easy to get from one place to another without really going out of your way. You're not having to detour a long distance. Whereas Walnut Creek, you'll notice a lot of streets don't connect. There's a lot of cul-de-sacs, which makes it really challenging for people who want to walk. And the other thing that we're finding, this is research done just a few years ago by Norm Garrick at the University of Connecticut, is that as we have more intersections, that is, as intersection density increases, that is, as we have more well-connected streets, we actually start seeing less crashes, less road fatalities. You'll notice in this case they looked at 24 California cities. Some were more urban with well-connected streets, others were more suburban. In the less safe cities, they saw fewer intersections, that is, less connected streets, and they saw 3 times as many road fatalities per 100,000 people than in the safer cities. So it's pretty dramatic. And again, part of that is because cars will go faster. We'll talk about that in the next segment on transportation. But it's also because the streets are wider, they're more hostile, and the speeds, of course, go higher. And that's, I think, a big part of it. So with safe, walkable streets, we want, again, those complete streets that are designed for people, not just cars. that are friendly to cars, pedestrians, and cyclists, but cars need to behave, and we get them to do that through the design of the street. We don't create streets that are so wide that cars feel comfortable going at high speeds. So these are streets that feel comfortable at slow speeds. If you were driving on the street, you probably wouldn't be comfortable going more than about 15, 20 miles per hour. They're narrow, they're compressed down. On the bigger streets, you know, we do design them for slightly higher speed, but again, we don't want overly high speeds. Obviously, we also need good sidewalks. Narrow sidewalks, like we see on the left, are great for young couples in love, but for average-sized folks, and I guess these folks are becoming more the average as we're seeing an obesity epidemic in this country, we need more space. So the recommendation is really that we need sidewalks that are at least 5 feet wide, and if they're next to the curb, like the one we see here on the right, we need to have a little bit more of a buffer. Obviously, we also need good street crossings. We know how to design those. Curb extensions, like we see on the bottom right, really shorten the distance people have to cross, make the pedestrian more visible, and just create a much safer environment for everybody. We're also starting to see cities that are taking back some of the parking spaces in their communities to create people places. And these are referred to as parklets. San Francisco, these are examples from San Francisco, has done a lot of this, but we're seeing it all across the country. Philadelphia, Seattle, Portland, and so on. And these are ways to also support local businesses. These are public spaces. They're not exclusively used by the businesses there, but they provide a place for people to linger outside those spaces. The 8th principle I'll talk about is fostering distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. And that's really, again, preserving some of the history and culture of these places. There's a great book by Jim Kunstler called The Geography of Nowhere, where he talks about how there is little sense of having arrived anywhere because every place looks like no place in particular. And you know, this kind of a shopping mall or shopping center you could see anywhere across the U.S. and if you just plop down there, you wouldn't necessarily know where in the U.S. you were located. But if you go to, let's say, Sonoma's Town Square, it's very distinctive. You know that you're there. Or if you go to the Gaslamp Quarter in San Diego, again, it has a distinctive quality and feel and architecture. You know that you're there. The 9th point we'll talk about is just the importance of really encouraging and engaging residents in the development decisions, in the planning process. We know that in the system of government we have, and the economic system we have in this country, the private sector is the one that does most of the development, but residents and local governments and other stakeholders really need to provide those developers with, you know, a clear vision of what they want to see in their communities and make sure that whatever gets built and developed is consistent with that. So I'm going to show an example here of a process that we've used at the Local Government Commission to engage residents. This actually is one of the first of these community design charrettes that we did back in 2000, 2001 in Tulare County in Cutler and Orosi, where we brought residents together. We had over 100 people, young and old, who participated in the community design charrette to really plan out what to do about the street, the highway really that goes through this community. It's important to make these fun, to not just make them work, but to actually, in this case, it's a Latino community, so we have the mariachis there. We got people to prioritize and talk about what they wanted to see in their community, what was most important. Finishing the sidewalk and better lighting, for example, got a lot of votes because there's a missing sidewalk between the two towns of Cutler and Orosi, or there was. Actually, after the charrette, Caltrans in the next few years built the missing sidewalk and completed that. And part of the process that we use is we actually go out and do what we call walking audits. That's something that I think you're going to all be doing in your sites, where you go out and you observe and see what works, what doesn't, and you start looking at potential solutions. The one on the left is in Cutler, the one on the right is in Baldwin Park. And then you get people from the community sitting around tables, looking at aerial photographs or maps, and writing down ideas and writing down their comments and really providing input so that the planners and the technical people in the community, the engineers and so on, can actually take that input and come up with good solutions to the problems that the residents are facing. This is an issue that LGC has focused a lot on over the years. We actually published a guidebook on public participation back in 1994, which we recently updated and is on our website. But what we find is that with good public participation, first of all, you get better plans because the residents in the communities know what the issues are, they know what the problems are, and they really can articulate those often a lot better than a consultant or staff that just goes out to that neighborhood every once in a while. It's obviously a great way to engage residents in the community, to make people overcome some of the cynicism about government. We also know that with good plans, often if you have political changes, it's important to have a group of stakeholders in the community that were there when the plan was developed, that can see it through to the end. And it's also a way to ensure the residents feel not that they have access to City Hall, but that they really do own City Hall. It's really a key part of the democratic process, and we see it really play out very nicely when we do these community design planning efforts. The last principle I'll talk to you about is this one, which is making development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective. And that again gets back to our vision is that local governments, communities really should establish the vision for how they want their community developed, and then set that down in their regulations and their zoning rules and so on, so that the private sector can then move forward. And it really comes down to taking places that look like this, not a place that's very attractive or where you want to spend much time, and thinking about how that place could maybe look a lot better and still have the same uses, but just make it a more friendly place that works better. So we really encourage communities to plan proactively, and we go back to actually, this is an example of a plan that was developed by the city of Pasadena back in the 90s. But it's important because they went through a whole process and engaged a lot of the residents about how to imagine a greater city. On the right, we see a map where they mapped out where they'd like to see light rail come through the city, or where light rail was being envisioned. And then the yellow were the areas where they wanted new development to take place. And if you go back to some of the plans that were made, this was a model of a new development that was proposed. You'll notice on the bottom left, light rail actually is cutting through there. So because they envisioned that, they knew the light rail would eventually come, they built it that way. And here we see this is the development to the left, to the right is City Hall. And if you just pan to the left, you see that sure enough, it took maybe 10, 15 years after that apartment complex was built, but light rail eventually did come through to Pasadena. It was because they had that proactive approach and they had a vision for how they wanted the community to grow. One of the tools available now that we encourage communities to use is form-based codes. This is a new approach to coding that really takes zoning a step further. A lot of zoning regulations really only regulate the use that's going to go on the land and the intensity of development. But with form-based codes, we actually can start getting sort of a three-dimensional picture of what's going to be developed. And the way these work is that they actually have sort of an urban design side to the code, which actually lays out what the code will call for. So in conventional code, this is sort of a standard zoning map from a city in California. One of our colleagues refers to this as Crayola zoning. You just sort of color out different parts of the map with different colors, and those symbols represent residential or general commercial or industrial development. But there's not a whole lot of, there's no sense of when this gets developed, how it's going to look in 3 dimensions. It's very 2-dimensional. With form-based codes, we actually start looking and seeing how these places can look. So in the upper left, in the upper part of this image, you see a site in downtown Petaluma, central Petaluma, that was going to be redeveloped. In the bottom, the form-based code actually draws out very clearly what that development might look like in the future. So where those buildings are located, even in some cases, the form-based code can get into the architectural details, are spelled out in the code. And this is actually the map for that Petaluma Smart Code. Here's an example from another city, Hercules, where the type of street really establishes where the building goes, how high it is, whether there's a front porch or not. So on the 4-lane avenue, you have sort of a street type that's laid out clearly, and then the buildings related to that, and then the parking, which is often behind the buildings. Finally, I'll talk about some of the legislation we have in California, which supports a lot of what we're talking about with smart growth. Some of you may have heard of SB 375. This was a law that was developed in 2008, which really gets us thinking regionally about how to implement these approaches. So back when the law was passed, it was viewed as sort of a major breakthrough because builders, developers actually came together with sort of the environmental community to say this is something that we can work with. The builders saw more certainty in the process, although this thing about a future of $5 gasoline, I guess, is not really playing out, at least not this year, but may in future years. And then on the environmental side, the environmental community really saw this as a win of dealing with, being able to deal with preserving, again, environmentally sensitive lands, and then also how to build these smarter communities with a mix of uses and addressing the concerns about transportation, housing, and climate change. So what SB 375 calls for is, first of all, the Air Resources Board is tasked with developing regional targets for greenhouse gas emissions tied to land use. So each major region of the state gets this target as to how much new greenhouse gas emissions are going to be, how you're going to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions as new development occurs. And a lot of that is going to be dependent on where development takes place, how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled, some of the issues we talked about. There's also then a requirement that the regional planning agencies, the councils of governments and metropolitan planning organizations, the MPOs, create a sustainable community strategy. This is the regional plan that meets those targets. And then that regional transportation funding has to be consistent with this new plan. And that's really the kicker here, because a lot of funding goes to the locals and the regions through transportation, and some of that funding will not go through if those plans do not meet those targets. So really what SB 375 is doing is tethering together regional transportation planning and housing for the first time. And there are also some incentives through streamlining of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, in order to conform to the new regional plans, even in cases where they might conflict with local plans. So there were some incentives given here to the development community as well. So this is a plan that was developed in the Sacramento region. They're one of the first sustainable community strategies in 2012. And I guess the red colors are highlighting where this more concentrated development will take place, where communities might grow out, and where there's already established communities. And the important thing here is that it really started shifting more houses and more jobs near transit. So what it's done is it's helped the regional planning agencies really look at developing more transit and also more walking and bicycling facilities over the next decades in order to, again, get a reduction in vehicle miles traveled and place more people closer to efficient transit at the regional level. This is looking at how, with the MTP SCS, that's the Sustainable Community Strategy, the actual number of congestion, the amount of heavy congestion residents would experience would actually be decreased because more transportation would be based on transit. So it's just showing how they're, going back to the 2002 Metropolitan Plan and then the 2008, the SCS even shifted the discussion more in order to get more transit over that period. So that's really the end of what I'm going to talk about today around land use and community design and smart growth. There's some great resources out there. There's, of course, materials on our website. There's the organization I mentioned earlier, the Smart Growth Network. Smart Growth America at the national level works on these issues. And then the Congress for the New Urbanism is an organization primarily of architects and urban designers, some of whom were involved in the development of the Awani Principles back in 1991, who continue to propose and espouse these ideas around creating great communities. So hopefully you'll have a chance to take a look at these and get a little bit more information on these approaches. Hope this was helpful. Feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions about any of the things I talked about, or if any of what I discussed maybe left you wanting more information, or if you were unclear on any of what I discussed. Thanks.